Hello, I'm Michael O'Shaughnessy, and today I'm going to be talking about Native traditions and the fight against climate change. For a brief introduction, I have always been interested in the subject of climate change, and I think that everybody should have a stake in making sure that we have a planet to live on for both ourselves and for future generations. And in the last few years, I've learned more about our country's treatment of its indigenous populations, and I've become more curious about what different tribes were and what their customs were, and especially their relationship with nature. In the course that I'm taking right now, Native American Literature, we read a novel called The Marrow Thieves by Metis author Cherie Dimaline, and I became interested in how some Indigenous land management and sustainability traditions could help us mitigate some of the effects of climate change. So what are some of the effects of climate change? We're already starting to see some of them today, most notably the melting of the glaciers and loss of ice at the poles, which will lead to both rising sea levels and coastal flooding. The picture of Boston on the left side of the screen shows a projected shoreline by the year 2050, and the area highlighted in blue is all area that's going to be underwater by that year. In other areas, we're going to see severe drought, which is going to cause problems with agriculture and access to clean drinking water. Another major issue is ocean acidification, which is going to cause marine ecosystem degradation and could cause the collapse of global food chains. And yet another major effect is the increased frequency and severity of natural disasters such as hurricanes and forest fires. There are some populations who are more at risk than others to experience the adverse effects due to climate change. For people living in poverty, the loss of housing and food can force them to slide further into poverty. Disabled people, the elderly, and even people who are pregnant can have a lot of trouble trying to evacuate when natural disasters strike. Children and the elderly are more susceptible to heat-related illnesses, and especially the elderly tend to have conditions such as obesity, diabetes, and respiratory disease that are made worse to exposure by the heat. For 2 degrees of global warming, 2 degrees Celsius of global warming, in the U.S., Black people are 34% more likely to live in areas with the highest projected increases of childhood asthma diagnoses, 40% more likely to live in areas with the highest projected increases in extreme temperature-related deaths. And Hispanic and Latino populations have high participation in weather-exposed fields such as construction or agriculture, which makes them more vulnerable to extreme temperatures. And they're 40% more likely to live in areas with the highest projected reductions in labor hours due to extreme temperature, and 50% more likely to live in areas with the highest projected increases in traffic delays due to coastal flooding. And this picture over on the left here is a picture of the Houma Nation in Louisiana, who were hit especially hard by Hurricane Ida earlier this year. So the first sustainability practice that I wanted to look into was wildfire management, especially in California, where we've had lots of problems with wildfires in the past few years. Prior to the U.S. settlement of that area, tribes in the area would practice controlled burns to clear out dried out underbrush, which prevented large-scale forest fires. But after the area was settled by the U.S., they banned cultural burning and focused instead on fire suppression. This allowed vegetation to build up and then dry out in the summer, which created kindling for large fires. This, coupled with global warming, that turned California into basically a tinderbox. And so what officials in California have been doing recently is they've been reaching out to local tribes and talking to them about starting to do controlled burns to mitigate this risk for the future. And it's been working. Moving on to farming and foraging practices, we have the 3 sisters, which are corn, beans, and squash. They would, when planted together, help each other grow. The corn would act as a pole for the bean vines to climb up, and in return, the bean vines would stabilize the corn in windy conditions. Bean roots have nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which make the nitrogen usable for plants, and the squash have large leaves and spikes on them that would protect the other 2 plants from wild animals. Native farmers also used wood ash and fish to fertilize their crops, which was very sustainable and didn't result in large amounts of agricultural runoff, that is a problem today. They also had a philosophy of keep it living, so they would try and keep their crops alive year after year, so this doesn't exhaust the soil and they wouldn't have to clear more forest for new fields. For foraging, in the plains, they would collect mouse beans or hog peanuts from the dens of rodents living in the plains. But when they did that, they would also leave gifts for these animals as a token of gratitude and respect for the gift that they've taken from these animals. They also engaged in seasonal foraging. So when different things were ripe at different times of the year, they wouldn't be overtaking from any one source of food. Moving on to indigenous hunting practices, like their farming and foraging practices, indigenous hunters had immense respect for the natural world, and this reflected in the way they hunted. They had spirituality practices to thank the animal for helping their survival. Every single part of the animal was used and nothing went to waste. Hunters didn't kill more animals than they needed to, and they only hunted after baby season out of respect for the animal. These sustainability practices culminate in the 7 generations philosophy, which tells us that we're responsible for preserving our planet for future generations. Under this philosophy, each generation learns about the 3 previous generations and teaches and protects both its own and the 3 generations following them. This philosophy is in direct opposition to the American expansionist philosophy of manifest destiny. Under manifest destiny, Americans believed that they had a divine right to the land, and this led to the large-scale removal of indigenous tribes and the large-scale exploitation of the natural world in the name of progress. Under this philosophy, there's no acknowledgement, accountability, or responsibility to preserve the planet for future generations. And we can see the continuation of this philosophy in our modern political climate, especially with the Biden administration's climate policy versus the action taken. They've acknowledged the effects of climate change, but they're not taking any responsibility or accountability to stop it. They promised to cut emissions in half by 2030, and they promised to take action against oil companies and polluters, but in the first 6 months of the Biden administration, they approved more than 2,100 oil drilling permits, and we're on track for 6,000 by the end of the year. And just days after the COP climate conference and the promises made there, they approved the sale of 80 million acres of water in the Gulf of Mexico for drilling. So I'd like to finish this off with a quote from the Marrow Thieves. A melting north meant the water levels rose and the weather changed. It changed to violence in some cases. Building tsunamis, spinning tornadoes, crumbling earthquakes, and the shapes of countries were changed forever. Whole coasts breaking off like crust. People died in the millions when that happened, but the powers that be still refuse to change. This is exactly what's going to happen if those in power don't take responsibility and step up to prevent the progression of climate change. If we can't come together and put the pressure on those at the top to actually make a change, the results will be catastrophic. Thank you for your time.